They cornered him under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. 3 cops with sneers on their faces, badges gleaming like weapons. "What's a guy like you doing in a neighborhood like this?" one of them barked, his tone dripping with disdain. The man stood silent, his hands raised, his calm demeanor only fueling their aggression. But what they didn't know was that this wasn't just any man. Beneath his quiet composure lay a history they couldn't begin to imagine. A history of discipline, survival, and unyielding strength. When they pushed too far, they unleashed something they weren't prepared for. Something that would not only expose their corruption, but remind them, and the world, that appearances can be deceiving. Before we jump into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love powerful stories of justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's get started. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention, at least not anymore. James Carter, a 42-year-old black man with a quiet smile and a worn leather jacket, blended into the background like he wanted to disappear. But beneath that unassuming exterior lay a story few could fathom. Once, James had been a force to be reckoned with, a decorated Marine who had seen the darkest corners of the world and walked through fire to protect his country. He had led missions others wouldn't dare to dream of, surviving on sheer willpower and unmatched skill. But after returning home, he traded the battlefield for a modest life, working at a small auto repair shop and keeping to himself. To most people, he was just the mechanic, someone who didn't talk much but always got the job done. But what they didn't see was the storm he kept locked away. The strength, discipline, and precision of a man who had been forged in the crucible of war. And it was that quiet strength that would soon be tested in a way James never saw coming. Because in a world where people judged him by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character, trouble was never far behind. This time, though, trouble had no idea what it was walking into. It started with flashing red and blue lights and the low hum of a police siren slicing through the quiet night. James had just finished his shift, his hands still greasy from fixing engines, when the patrol car pulled up behind him. He wasn't speeding, hadn't broken any laws, but something about him, his skin, his presence, seemed to set them off. "Step out of the car," one officer barked, his voice sharp and commanding. James complied, his hands visible, his movements deliberate. He'd been here before, too many times. "What's in the bag?" another demanded, pointing at James's duffel on the passenger seat. "It's just my tools," James replied calmly, but his words fell on deaf ears. They rummaged through his belongings like scavengers, tossing wrenches and screwdrivers onto the asphalt. One officer smirked, leaning in close. "You think you can just waltz through here without us noticing? You don't belong in this neighborhood." The humiliation was palpable, each taunt and sneer chipping away at his dignity. A small crowd gathered, their murmurs carrying a mix of outrage and fear. James's fists clenched at his sides, the discipline he'd honed in the Marines keeping him from reacting. But inside, a storm brewed, and as one officer shoved him against the hood of his car, pressing his weight down hard, James's mind raced, not with anger, but with calculation, because he knew something they didn't, and soon they would find out the hard way. What the officers couldn't see was the subtle shift in James's demeanor, a calm that wasn't born from fear, but from experience. As they barked orders and tightened their grip, James's mind worked like a well-oiled machine, scanning every detail, calculating every move. He wasn't just standing there. He was assessing. These weren't just bullies with badges. They were sloppy, overconfident, and reckless. James had dealt with worse. Enemy combatants who would have made these men look like amateurs. Back then, he'd been a squad leader, entrusted with the lives of his team in hostile territories. Every decision he made had to be perfect because failure wasn't an option. And those skills hadn't faded. Beneath the surface of the quiet mechanic was a man trained to adapt, to survive, and to strike when the moment was right. He could feel the tension in his muscles, the instinct to act simmering just below the surface. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was home. And James knew better than anyone that the fight here was different. These men didn't just want to control him. They wanted to break him. But they'd made a mistake. Because James wasn't just any man, and the fight they thought they were winning was about to take a turn they'd never expect. James felt the tension in the air shift as one officer stepped closer, a smug grin plastered across his face. "You're too calm," the officer sneered, poking James in the chest with his baton. "What are you hiding?" James didn't flinch. His voice was steady as he replied, "Nothing. You've already gone through my things." But his calm seemed to irritate them even more. The officer gestured to his colleagues, and suddenly they were shoving James to the ground, patting him down like he was a dangerous criminal. "You got a record, huh? Bet we'll find something if we dig deep enough," one of them jeered. James bit back the urge to respond. He knew how this worked, how they'd twist his words and turn the situation against him. As they ran his ID through their system, the seconds felt like hours. James knew they wouldn't find anything, but the process was a game of power, meant to humiliate him. Meanwhile, the murmurs from the gathered crowd grew louder. A young woman had her phone out, recording everything, her defiance a flicker of hope in the oppressive scene. But then, something unexpected happened. The radio on one of the officers crackled to life. "James Carter?" The dispatcher's voice cut through the tension. "Former Marine, Silver Star recipient?" The officer's smug grin faltered as he exchanged a glance with his partner. James caught the hesitation in their eyes, the momentary flicker of doubt. They were starting to realize they might have picked the wrong man to harass. And as their facade of control began to crack, James knew it wasn't just his name that had them on edge. This was far from over, and the truth about these officers, their corruption, their crimes, was about to unravel in a way they couldn't stop. The moment was electric. The lead officer, visibly rattled by the dispatcher's words, quickly tried to regain his composure. "Silver Star or not," he snapped, "you're still out of line." But his voice wavered, betraying the confidence he once had. James stood now, his calm unshaken, his eyes piercing through the facade of authority in front of him. "Out of line?" he said, his voice low but commanding. "You don't even know the line you've crossed." The young woman recording stepped closer, her camera catching every word. "Why don't you tell them about the real reason you're out here harassing people?" she said boldly, her voice cutting through the silence. The officers froze, their eyes darting between her and James. "Should I help her out?" James continued, his tone measured but sharp. "Or maybe I'll start. How about the missing evidence from that warehouse case? Or the reports of brutality that keep disappearing from your precinct?" The officers exchanged panicked glances now, the weight of their secrets hanging heavy in the air. James took a step forward, his presence suddenly towering. "You think the uniform makes you untouchable? I've been in places where you wouldn't last 5 minutes, and I can tell you this, you've already lost." The crowd was silent, every eye fixed on James. Then another voice cut through, the young woman again holding her phone up. "And now, the whole world is about to see it too." The officers' radios crackled again. This time, it wasn't the dispatcher but another voice, firm and authoritative. "Officer Stevenson, Officer Miller, return to the precinct immediately. Internal Affairs wants a word." The color drained from their faces. The truth was out, and the tables had turned. As the officers retreated, the crowd erupted in cheers, but James simply stood there, unmoved. He wasn't looking for applause. He was looking for justice, and this was just the beginning. As the police car sped away, its flashing lights fading into the distance, James stood in the glow of the street lamp, surrounded by a crowd that now looked at him with admiration and respect. The young woman lowered her phone, a satisfied smile on her face. "You did it," she said softly. "You stood up to them." James shook his head. "We did it," he replied. "They only back down when they know people are watching, when they know they can't hide anymore." He glanced at the crowd, his voice carrying a quiet authority. But this isn't over. It doesn't end with just a video or a confrontation. It ends when we stop letting them think this is normal. The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger now tempered by hope. James could see it in their faces, the spark of change, the belief that standing together meant something. As the crowd began to disperse, the young woman approached James. "You're not just a mechanic, are you?" she asked, her tone laced with curiosity. James chuckled faintly. "I'm just someone who's seen enough to know when it's time to stand up." Later that night, sitting alone in his modest apartment, James stared at an old photo of his Marine unit. He thought about the battles he had fought overseas and the new battles he faced here at home. The fight was different, but the mission was the same: protect those who couldn't protect themselves and stand firm against injustice. The next day, the video of the confrontation went viral, sparking outrage and leading to a full investigation into the officers. But, for James, it wasn't about the headlines or the vindication. It was about reminding people that courage and integrity could make a difference, no matter how overwhelming the odds. And so, the morale stood clear. Strength isn't just about physical power or military training. It's about resilience, standing tall in the face of adversity, and refusing to let injustice go unanswered. Because when one person stands, it gives others the courage to do the same. Thank you for watching. Maya's story reminds us that standing up for what's right can create lasting change. Whether it's overcoming adversity or challenging injustice, your voice matters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts on the story. Let's keep this conversation going. And remember, sharing these stories helps spread the message of justice and fairness, one act of courage at a time. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.